Hello there. Tonight we are going back in time. Back 5 centuries, across dark seas and tangled rainforests, to a place where whispers in the leaves carried secrets no European could truly grasp. This is the story of Hans Staden, a young German who crossed an ocean in search of fortune, but found himself instead deep in the steaming jungles of 16th century Brazil. A prisoner, a guest, and a witness to rituals that chilled his bones. Take a deep breath with me. Let the room around you grow quiet. Let the hum of your day fade, like sails disappearing on the horizon. Wherever you are, in bed, on your sofa, or tucked beneath blankets. Rest your eyes, breathe slowly, and drift with me into this forgotten world. Tonight, we will follow Hans step by cautious step, through salt air, tangled vines, and fires that crackled with meanings lost to time. There will be fear here, yes, but also wonder, small mercies, and the steady heartbeat of survival. So settle in, let your thoughts slow, and listen as we begin. Long before the jungle swallowed him whole, Hans Staden's story began on cold European docks. Creaking timbers, brine in the wind, barrels of salted meat stacked beside damp coils of rope. Hans was no stranger to hardship. His family in Hesse had known hunger, plague, the silent knock of debt collectors at the door. He was young, strong enough to fight, smart enough to navigate a merchant deck, restless enough to sign his name on a contract that promised faraway gold. In the spring of 1554, Hans found himself aboard a Portuguese caravel bound for Brazil, a strip of coast rumored to hide riches beneath its canopies. Sugar, dyewood, souls for the missions. The priests called it salvation. The traders called it profit. For Hans, it was just another chance, a place where a man with quick hands and a willing back might carve a sliver of safety out of the wild. But the Atlantic did not give up its prize so easily. For weeks, their sails strained under winds that howled like wolves. Salt crusted every plank. Storms cracked masts and splintered resolve. Men died quietly in the night, their bodies tipped over the side with brief prayers whispered into roaring waves. And Hans, stomach hollow and spirit raw, clung to the thought of land. Just one glimpse of green, one taste of fresh water, one dawn when the horizon did not mock him with endless blue. When the coast of Brazil finally appeared, it rose from the ocean like a fever dream, a ragged band of jungle that steamed in the afternoon sun, its treetops glistening like wet emeralds. Birds wheeled overhead, flashes of red and blue. Somewhere behind the wall of trees, a river wound its secret way inland, carrying songs Hans would never understand. Their battered ship limped toward shore. The captain, more salt than flesh by now, promised an easy landing. There were friendly villages here, he claimed, alliances waiting, traders eager to swap beads for food, iron for guides. Hans wanted to believe him. He leaned over the rail, peering at the shifting shadows between the trunks, the slow undulation of vines in the humid breeze. Land, at last. The first boats went ashore at dawn. 6 men in a skiff, oars dipping like cautious whispers. Hans volunteered to join them. He carried a musket, though the powder was damp and the barrel pitted from salt spray. His boots sloshed with seawater, each step a reminder of the weeks adrift. As they approached the beach, the forest seemed to draw nearer too, branches knitting together like hands clasped in prayer or warning. At first, it was quiet. So quiet Hans could hear his own breath echo in his skull. They hauled the skiff onto the sand, boots sinking deep into warmth that felt like forgiveness. Hans knelt, scooped up a handful, and let it run through his fingers. Solid ground. He tasted the air, earthy, sharp with something blooming just out of sight. Behind him, the others spread out, calling softly into the trees. No answer came. No smoke curled above the canopy. The captain's promises felt thin as the waves. Still, Hans shouldered his musket and stepped forward. If there was food to find, he would find it. He never saw the spears until they moved. The first spear didn't strike Hans. It struck the sand near his boot, burying its obsidian tip deep enough to stand quivering in the early light. For a heartbeat, the forest seemed to hold its breath, vines swaying as if they too were alive and waiting.
Hans fruse.
The other sailors turned, shouts dying in their throats as figures emerged from the green. They came silently, barefoot men and boys painted in streaks of red clay and black soot. Their hair was bound high, feathers woven through braids that trembled with every step. Each carried something: spears, bows strung tight, clubs of wood polished by many hands. And every pair of eyes was fixed on Hans and his companions. One sailor, his name already lost to the ocean's memory, raised his musket. He fired, a hiss more than a shot, the powder wet and useless. The click echoed like mockery. Then the painted men moved, not a rush but a closing of a trap. 2 sailors fell at once, the forest swallowing their cries before they reached the beach. Hans staggered backward, musket dropped in the sand. He heard himself say something in broken Portuguese. A plea, an apology, a promise he could not keep. A blow caught him across the shoulders, driving him to his knees. The world tilted, sand in his mouth, the taste of salt and blood. He rolled to his side, staring up at a face that was neither angry nor triumphant, only watchful. The warrior who stood over him seemed young, no older than Hans himself. He spoke, a word Hans did not know, then struck him again, not to kill but to silence. When Hans woke, the sun was higher, a white eye glaring down through the canopy. He was on his back, wrists bound with cord rough enough to burn. Around him, the other survivors, 2 of the original 6, knelt with heads lowered, their own hands tied behind them. The forest felt close now, the smell of green things overwhelming the salt still crusted on Hans's lips. He tried to rise, but a foot pressed him back down. Another warrior, older, broader in the shoulders, studied Hans with an expression like a butcher deciding which cut of meat to take first. Hans did not struggle. He had seen enough men die at sea to know when a fight was lost. Voices rose and fell around him. Sharp syllables traded between the warriors. One stepped forward, knelt, and touched Hans's face with the back of his hand. The gesture was gentle, almost curious, but when Hans flinched, the man laughed. Not cruelly, but as if Hans were a child who had barked at thunder. Then came the rope, looped around Hans's neck, the same coarse fiber that bound his wrists. They did not drag him, not yet. Instead, they gestured rough pushes that made clear what was expected. Stand, walk, obey. So Hans stood, swaying on unsteady legs. The sand was warm beneath his bare feet. His boots were gone, stripped from him like his musket, his belt, the tiny pouch of coins sewn into his coat. He tried to speak. "Friend," he whispered, in Portuguese first, then in the broken Tupi words he had learned from the sailors who traded along this coast. The warriors ignored him. Words were not needed now. The march began at the edge of the trees. The forest swallowed them in green, high branches braiding the sunlight into shifting patches of gold and shadow. The path, if it was a path, was little more than a deer trail winding through ferns taller than a man. Insects droned in the heat, brushing Hans's skin like ghostly fingers. He stumbled often. Each time he fell, the rope jerked him back up. Not violently, not yet. They needed him to walk. Hours blurred. Thirst cracked his tongue. His shoulders ached where the musket strap had once rested, the skin raw from the salt and sun. Once, they stopped beside a stream, a clear trickle running over stones furred with moss. Hans lowered himself, cupped water in his bound hands. It tasted of iron and leaf rot, but he drank greedily. A child, a boy with hair bound in twin knots, crouched beside him, staring. When Hans looked up, The boy flicked water into his face and giggled, then darted back to his mother's side. They did not speak to him, these captors. They spoke around him, short commands, soft laughter, occasional bursts of singing that rose above the hiss of cicadas. Hans listened, catching the same words again and again. Tupinamba. He had heard that name whispered on the ship. A people fierce and proud, sworn enemies of the Portuguese. And now they had him, a living prize plucked from the edge of the world. By dusk, the forest opened like a wound into a clearing ringed by huts low and round, their thatched roofs sloping almost to the ground. Smoke rose from fires that flickered red in the gathering dark. Children darted between adults, their feet kicking up dust. Dogs barked, tails whipping the air. Women, bare-armed and strong, bent over wide clay pots, stirring with sticks that sent up spirals of fragrant steam. Hans was pushed to the center of the village. The rope around his neck was tied to a stout post driven deep into the earth. There he stood, legs trembling, breath shallow in his chest. I found him, dozens of them, old men with skin folded like river stones, young mothers nursing babies who squirmed and stared, warriors leaning on spears dark with old blood, and somewhere in the shifting ring of faces, laughter. Not mocking but curious, the sound of people greeting something new, strange, and full of possibility. One figure stepped forward, taller than the others, shoulders painted in lines of white ash that glowed against skin the color of rich earth. He carried no weapon, only a staff wound with feathers and beads. His gaze locked on Hans. Not cruel, not warm, just steady. He spoke, a single word that rippled through the crowd like a spark catching dry grass. Hans said nothing. What could he say? His mouth moved around prayers half remembered from church pews in Hesse, but they caught in his throat. He bowed his head instead, not in submission, not yet, but because looking anywhere else felt wrong. A hand touched his chin. Hans flinched, eyes snapping open. A woman stood before him now, older than the painted warriors, hair streaked gray and bound in braids that fell to her waist. Her face was lined, but her eyes were sharp as fresh-cut obsidian. She did not speak. She studied him like a merchant inspecting flawed wares. Her fingers traced the bruise blooming on his cheek, brushed the dried salt crusting his collar. Then she stepped back, spoke a word Hans did not know, and turned away. The villagers moved as one, a soft rustle of feet on packed earth. They left him tied but not gagged, alone but not out of sight. Fires crackled. Drums began. A slow beat, steady as the pulse at his throat. The smell of cooking meat drifted on the humid night. Hans closed his eyes. He was not dead, not yet. He was not free, not ever, perhaps. But he was alive. And for this night, that was enough. In the darkness beyond the firelight, the forest breathed. Insects sang their shrill nocturnes. Somewhere, an old woman whispered to the flames. Words Hans could not know, words that bound him tighter than any rope. He listened, he breathed, and the drums kept time with a heart that was no longer wholly his own. Hans did not sleep the first night. He dozed, yes, drifted in the shallow way a man drifts when chained to the possibility of a knife in the dark. His back pressed to the rough post, legs drawn up to his chest. He let the hum of insects and the steady drumbeat braid themselves into something like a lullaby. But every time his eyes closed fully, they snapped open at the smallest sound. A twig, a cough, the hush of bare feet against packed earth. Somewhere behind him, the old woman's voice rose and fell in broken verses. He did not understand the words, but the rhythm lulled him deeper into that thin space between waking and sleep. He dreamt once of Germany, of snow gathering on the crooked eaves of his mother's house, of heavy bread warm from the oven, of church bells tolling over a frozen river. He woke to the heat of Brazil pressing against his ribs like a brand. At dawn, they came for him. 2 boys this time, young, lean, naked but for strings of beads at their necks and ankles. They spoke softly to each other, glancing at Hans with quick bird-like eyes. When they untied the rope from the stake, they didn't yank him upright. One tugged gently at his wrist, then pointed toward the center of the village where smoke was already rising from fresh fires. Hans staggered to his feet, bones stiff, tongue dry. His mouth tasted of old sweat and salt. The boys did not speak to him again. They walked ahead, barefoot, giggling now and then as if escorting a curious stray animal. The village at dawn was almost beautiful. Shafts of early sun speared through the trees, catching on smoke trails that lifted in soft ribbons toward the canopy. Women squatted beside fires, stirring pots of root mash and salted fish. Old men sat on mats woven from palm fronds, chewing leaves and muttering through toothless grins. Children dashed between them like pups, laughing too loudly and dodging half-hearted swats from mothers with babies on their hips. Hans was led to a low hut near the edge of the circle. It was simple, a frame of poles lashed with vines, walls of woven reeds, a roof thatched thick with palm leaves. Inside, the air was cool compared to the humid press of the clearing. He was pushed gently to a mat in the corner. Someone handed him a gourd of water. Another pushed a bowl of thick white paste, manioc he guessed, into his hands. He ate slowly, cautious not to spill or choke under the watch of so many eyes. The paste stuck to his teeth, bland and earthy but filling. When he finished, he placed the bowl at his feet and bowed his head slightly, an instinct borrowed from cathedral aisles half a world away. A few women watched him through the doorway, whispering to each other behind cupped palms. No one spoke to him directly, but no one struck him either. His wrists were still bound but loosely now, enough that he could feed himself, enough that he felt the illusion of freedom like a cruel joke hovering at the edge of his thoughts. Outside the hut, the drums resumed. Not loud this time, just a soft tapping, like the heartbeat of the forest made flesh. Hans strained to listen for words between the beats, but none came. Instead, he heard life unfold around him. The bark of dogs, the high laugh of children, the snap and crackle of firewood. Hours blurred into a dull haze. The heat climbed. The air inside the hut thickened with smoke drifting in from the fires. Once, a young girl crept to the doorway, her hair bound in a loop on her crown, her face painted with a simple stripe of ochre across her brow. She studied Hans for a long moment, then darted forward and touched his boot, the only thing left of his old life. She giggled when Hans flinched, then vanished back into the sunlit chaos. He wondered then if she had ever seen boots before, if she knew that somewhere across an ocean stood cities so crowded that strangers brushed shoulders without so much as a nod, where church bells rang over stone streets that reeked of horses and fish and sweat. He wondered if he would ever stand in such a street again, or if his bones would join the ones he sometimes glimpsed hanging from the rafters in the bigger huts, picked clean and painted, made sacred by teeth that could crush stone. Near dusk, the old woman appeared again. She stepped inside without a word, her presence as calm and deliberate as the steady drumbeat that never seemed to fade. In her hands she carried a bundle of leaves bound with twine. She knelt beside Hans, not asking permission as she reached for his wrists. He flinched, a useless reflex. Her eyes flicked up to meet his. There was no anger there, no warmth either. Just the deep, patient gravity of someone who understood that time was a river and Hans was just another branch caught in its current. She untied the cord around his wrists, her fingers quick and sure. She did not rub the raw skin or offer water. Instead, she opened the bundle, revealing a paste the color of wet clay. She dabbed it gently onto the red grooves around his wrists, humming low under her breath as she worked. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and rattled a small gourd near his ear. The seeds inside clicked and hissed like dry rain. She said a word sharp, guttural, and waited. Hans didn't understand, but he nodded anyway. She repeated it. This time he whispered it back, mouth clumsy around the alien syllables. She nodded once, then rose and left him alone again, the seeds still rattling in her palm as she vanished into the dusk. That night, the village gathered around the main fire. Hans was not tied to the stake this time. He was not tied at all, but he was watched. 2 warriors flanked him, spears planted firmly in the dirt. Their eyes never left him, but their faces were calm. Not hostile, not mocking, just aware. A circle of dancers moved around the fire, their feet stirring the dust into ghostly swirls that caught the flames' glow. Drums pounded slow and deep. Voices rose. Not words Hans could grasp, but sounds that coiled through his gut and tightened there, pulling at memories he didn't know he carried. At the center of it all stood the tall warrior who had struck him first on the beach. His chest was painted now, a white spiral curling around one nipple and climbing his shoulder like a snake. In his hand, he held a long staff crowned with feathers and small bones that rattled each time he stamped the earth. He chanted, low and rhythmic, his voice weaving through the drumbeat until the two became indistinguishable. Children sat cross-legged near the fire, their eyes wide, mouths half open. Women swayed behind them, some clapping in time, others tapping smooth stones together. Hans sat still, back straight, hands resting on his knees. He tried not to flinch when the staff-bearer approached him, circling, chanting louder now. The warrior's eyes locked onto Hans's. There was something there, not malice, not mercy. Something older, something that made Hans's skin prickle with a fear that was deeper than any blade. A word rose from the circle, passed from mouth to mouth, rippling outward like a stone dropped in a pond. Kaiba. Hans caught it. He'd heard it before, whispered once when the old woman had tended to him. He did not know its meaning, but he knew enough to bow his head when the staff-bearer stopped before him and struck the earth 3 times. The circle roared then, not in anger but in approval. The drums quickened. The chant rose and fell like the ocean on a restless night. And in that moment, Hans understood, if not the meaning, then the weight of it. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was something else now. A word passed from lip to lip, shaped by voices older than the letters he had once scratched onto paper in a cold German schoolhouse. When the fire sank low and the drums faded, Hans was led back to the small hut. He was not tied. The 2 warriors left him at the doorway without a glance back. He stepped inside alone, the memory of the chant still echoing behind his eyes. He lay down on the mat, pulling the woven reed over his shoulders though the night air was warm. Outside, the village quieted. Not silent, never silent. Somewhere an old woman rattled seeds into the dark. Somewhere a child laughed in its sleep. Somewhere far beyond the last fire's glow, the forest whispered things that Hans knew he would never understand. And Hans lay still, staring up at the thatch above him, wondering which was worse, being a prisoner in chains or being free in a cage built from eyes and drums and a single word that now belonged to him alone. Morning arrived before Hans could convince his mind to rest. He woke to soft daylight leaking through the gaps in the woven walls. The scent of smoke and damp earth clung to him like a second skin. Somewhere nearby, the same rhythmic tapping of stones rose and fell. Women grinding cassava root, pounding it to paste for the morning meal. Hans sat up slowly. His back ached from nights on the hard mat, but at least he was not chained. He flexed his wrists where the old woman's paste had dried and flaked off during the night. The skin beneath was raw but no longer bled when he moved. A small boy appeared at the hut's entrance, staring with dark, curious eyes. He carried a clay bowl, both hands wrapped around its sides as if it contained something precious. When Hans met his gaze, the boy didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward and placed the bowl at Hans's feet. Then, wordless, he slipped away, feet whispering over packed earth. Inside the bowl was more of the thick manioc mash, this time mixed with something sour. A tang of fermentation that made Hans's empty stomach lurch but his mouth water at the same time. He ate with his fingers, the same way he'd seen the villagers do, mimicking the way they scooped small portions instead of shoveling it in hungrily. He had learned enough in just a few days. To appear greedy was to appear savage. If they were to see him as something more than meat, he could not look like an animal. When he finished, he left the bowl just inside the doorway. The sun was stronger now, flooding the clearing with golden haze. Smoke rose in soft tendrils from the cooking fires. Children darted around the huts, chasing each other between legs and logs. Old men squatted near the main fire, telling stories in slow, winding cadences that rose and fell like the tide. Though Hans did not know the words, the tone told him enough. These were stories meant to teach. Warnings, memories, maps for those too young to remember what danger smelled like. The tall warrior with the painted spiral across his chest approached mid-morning. He did not speak but gestured for Hans to stand. Hans obeyed at once. Each movement felt deliberate, like a stone placed just right in a river to divert its flow. They walked beyond the huts this time, out past the circle where villagers prepared food and children practiced their small dances. The trees swallowed them quickly. Great trunks wrapped in vines, roots like grasping fingers pushing up through the damp soil. They moved in silence for a time, the warrior leading with steps so quiet Hans felt clumsy crashing along behind him. Birds called overhead. Something large rustled off the path, but the warrior did not react. So Hans forced himself not to look. After perhaps half an hour, they reached the river. Broad and slow-moving, it reflected the sun in blinding shards of silver. A woman stood waist-deep near the bank, her long hair drifting behind her like weed in the current. She did not look at them. She slapped wet cloth against a flat stone, each strike sharp and steady. The warrior turned to Hans, pointed at the river, then at Hans's chest and arms. The message was clear: wash, become clean, be presentable. For whom, Hans wondered? For the spirits? For the chief? Or simply for the eyes always watching him? He stripped to his ragged breeches and stepped into the water. It was colder than he expected, a welcome bite against the heat. He ducked under once, twice, scrubbing grime and dried sweat from his chest and neck. He scraped dirt from his beard, now a coarse mat that clung to his jaw like moss on a stone. When he emerged, the warrior waited with something new. A strip of cloth dyed dull red and yellow, rough but clean. Hans took it and wrapped it around his waist as he had seen others do. The warrior nodded once, a flicker of approval in his otherwise impassive face. They returned to the village in silence. By afternoon, Hans understood this was a test, not one of words or blades but of patience. He was watched constantly. The boys who delivered his food, the old women who pretended not to see him as they wove baskets by the fire, the warriors who lingered at the edge of the clearing, always within reach but never too close. One boy, bolder than the rest, crept near his hut after dusk. Hans sat outside, trying to mimic the posture of the old men. Legs crossed, elbows resting on knees, face calm. The boy stopped a few feet away and stared openly. Around his neck hung a string of beads, each bead carved from something dark. Bone, perhaps, or polished nut. The boy raised one hand and mimed a gesture. A sweeping circle in the air, then a tap on his own chest. He said something Hans could not hope to understand. But Hans mimicked the gesture back, tapping his own chest just as the boy had done. The boy grinned, revealing a missing tooth. He giggled, spun on his heel, and vanished into the dark. That night, Hans lay awake under the thatched roof. He turned the boy's gesture over in his mind. A greeting? A blessing? A warning? He thought of the word he had heard echo around the fire. Kaiba. He repeated it under his breath, shaping the strange syllables with his tongue. He did not know if it meant prisoner, foreigner, spirit man, or sacrifice. Perhaps it meant all those things at once. Words here were not just sounds. They were nets, cast wide to catch meaning that shifted with the tide. He remembered the old woman's eyes, dark pools that seemed to reflect things Hans could not see. He thought of the staff-bearer, his painted chest, his eyes locked to Hans's across the firelight. He thought of the chief, still distant, still silent, yet orbiting his thoughts like a hidden star. And above all, Hans thought of the silence that fell between drumbeats. He had come to dread that silence more than any scream. In the gaps, decisions were made, judgments passed, perhaps even spirits gathered to listen to the village breathe. The days stretched. Hans learned to sit quietly when children came to peer at him. He learned to accept food without meeting eyes too boldly. Once, when a small girl placed a stick in his lap, a gift or a game, he could not tell. He had learned to smile gently, not laugh too loud, not flinch when she touched his strange pale beard. He learned, too, that each act was measured. Each breath weighed on an invisible scale he could not see but felt pressing down on his chest at night. He was not chained to the post anymore, but he was still bound. Bound by eyes, by words, by a story he could not read but was now written into. On the 5th day, the old woman came again. This time she carried no paste, no seeds. She sat near Hans's hut just as dusk fell, the air turning soft and heavy with the smoke of cooking fires. She did not speak. She did not look at him directly. Instead, she rattled her gourd softly, the seeds whispering secrets Hans knew were not for him. When she finally rose, she pressed something into Hans's palm, a single bead carved from bone, warm from her hand. She did not explain. She did not wait to see if he understood. She simply slipped away, her bare feet silent against the packed earth. Hans stared at the bead long after she had gone. Felt like a question, or maybe an answer. He turned it over in his fingers until the last ember of the fire near his hut flickered out and the forest began its night chorus of whispers and clicks and distant drums. When he finally slept, the bead clutched tight in his fist. Hans dreamt of snow again, but this time the snow was red, and overhead, the drums called something ancient out of the trees, something that watched him sleep with eyes older than the forest, eyes that did not blink. At dawn, the forest shimmered with mist. Hans woke slowly, the single bone bead still pressed into the hollow of his palm, leaving a small, perfect indentation in his skin. He studied it in the soft gray light. It looked like nothing, a scrap of polished bone, its edges worn smooth by the press of many fingers before his own. Yet he knew, even without words, that this was no simple trinket. Here, nothing given by the old woman was without purpose. He slipped the bead onto the strip of vine that tied back his hair. When he emerged from his hut, a child watched him from the path, the same bold boy who had mimed the circle on his chest. The boy's eyes flicked to the bead, then to Hans's face. He did not smile, but his head tilted, as if making a small note only the trees could hear. The village was waking. Smoke rose in pale spirals. The low murmur of voices drifted between the huts, mingling with the hush of the river somewhere beyond the trees. For a moment, Hans felt a strange ache, a memory of his mother's kitchen, the smell of fresh bread at dawn, the hush of snow against wooden shutters. It dissolved as quickly as it came. The forest did not allow such memories to linger for long. He was not left alone that morning. 2 men waited for him near the central fire, both warriors, marked by painted lines running from brow to chin. They carried no weapons but did not need any. They gestured for Hans to follow. He did, without question. They led him away from the cluster of huts, deeper than he had gone before. The path was a thin vein cut through thick brush. The warriors walked ahead, steps silent, the leaves closing behind them like a living wall. Hans felt the forest press in, 1,000 eyes hidden behind bark and broad leaves. Every vine seemed to twitch as he passed. After some time, the trail widened into a clearing, not as large as the main village but carefully kept. The ground swept of debris, the earth packed smooth and clean. In the center stood a single post driven deep into the soil. From its top hung strings of beads and feathers that shifted in the morning breeze, clicking softly together like teeth. The warriors stopped. One gestured to Hans, then to the post. Slowly, Hans stepped closer. He could see now that the post was stained dark at its base. Old blood, perhaps, or dye rubbed deep into the wood. He did not know which answer unsettled him more. The two men began to chant, a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated in Hans's chest. It was not a song of anger. It was more like the drone of bees around a hive, steady and patient. One of the men stepped forward, pressing a hand to Hans's chest. His palm was rough, his eyes unreadable. Hans stood still as the man lifted the strip of vine from his hair. The single bead dropped into the warrior's hand. He held it up, turning it so the light caught its smooth surface, then tied it back into Hans's hair with a new knot, tighter, deliberate. It was a ritual. That much Hans understood. He did not know if it marked him as prey or protector. Both, perhaps. They stayed in the clearing for a long time. The men did not speak to Hans but worked together at the base of the post, arranging small bundles of herbs, tapping ash from burnt sticks, sprinkling fine powders that shimmered briefly before the wind carried them away.
Hans vatsked, unmoving.
He realized this was not about him, not entirely. He was a piece of the ritual, a living ingredient in a larger meal he could not taste. When they finished, they turned back toward the village without a word. Hans followed. The forest closed around them again, swallowing the post and its whispering beads behind layers of green. Back in the village, life continued as if nothing had happened. Children chased each other in spirals around the fire pits. Women tended to small pots bubbling over low flames. An old man sat near the edge of the clearing, humming to himself, a gourd resting on his knee. Hans lowered himself to the mat outside his hut. He tried to appear calm, to mirror the stillness of the old men he saw every day. But inside, his mind spun circles. He could not read their language, yet every gesture carved new lines into his understanding. He was being shaped, not with chains or clubs, but with symbols, beads, painted marks. He wondered how far they would go before they tested whether he would break. That night, the drums returned. This time they were closer. Not distant thunder, but steady pulses just beyond the huts, like a heartbeat pressed against the village walls. Hans sat upright, listening to the rhythm slip between the cracks of the woven hut. Through the open doorway, he saw figures moving between the fires. Faces painted in broad white lines, eyes bright in the flicker of flame. They did not speak loudly. Their movements were deliberate, almost reverent. A small group gathered near the main clearing. Hans could see them in glimpses, silhouettes circling the central fire pit, each step matching the low boom of the drums. The air smelled of smoked meat and crushed herbs, clung to his tongue thick and sour. Then he saw him, the chief, Cunhambebe, the name that silenced laughter, that bent warriors at the knee. He moved through the gathering like a shadow with weight, the lines of white paint looping across his chest like the marks of a spirit made flesh. Hans knew without being told that he would be summoned. He rose from the mat, his legs stiff, his heartbeat threading itself to the rhythm of the drums. When the boy arrived, the same bold boy with the missing tooth, he needed no words. He simply pointed. Hans followed. He stepped into the clearing as the dancers parted to let him pass. He felt their eyes graze over him like blades, curious, wary, calculating. He felt like meat again, but also something more, a bone with a story inside it. The chief waited near the fire, He was massive in the firelight, shadows pooling in the hollows of his shoulders, the glint of polished shell and jaguar teeth strung around his throat. When Hans drew close, the drums fell silent. No one spoke. The air seemed to listen for him to breathe. Cunhambebe stepped forward and pressed a hand to Hans's chest. Not a blow, not a shove, just a weight that settled him back into the world. He muttered something Hans could not understand, his voice deep and rolling like distant thunder. One of the warriors brought a bowl. Inside was a paste thick and dark, smelling of fruit turned sharp and the faint metallic tang Hans now recognized as blood, animal blood, he hoped. The chief dipped his fingers in and marked Hans's chest with looping swirls, tracing each line slowly, pressing until Hans felt the pattern sink through his skin to his ribs. When it was done, Cunhambebe stepped back and raised his hands. The drums resumed, softer now, almost tender. The warriors began their slow circle again, feet stirring dust that rose like breath from the earth. Hans stood still in the center, marked and watched. He realized he was not being displayed. He was being rewritten. The ritual lasted until the fire burned low. When they finally let him step away, Hans felt the paint crusting on his chest, tight and dry. He wondered what it meant. Protection, perhaps, or a warning. Or maybe it was simply a promise that he would never truly leave this place, even if he found a ship tomorrow to carry him back across the salt water. The old woman waited near the edge of the clearing. She did not speak when he passed. She only raised her hand, palm open, showing him a second bead resting in her weathered skin. This time, Hans did not hesitate. He took it, closing his fingers around its warmth. In that moment, he felt the bond tighten. He was no longer just a captive. He was a vessel for their belief, a story they had chosen to tell through his skin. When he returned to his hut, the beads whispered against each other in his hair. Outside, the drums faded to a hush. The forest answered in clicks and sighs, as if repeating the same name over and over. Hans lay down, eyes wide to the darkness, listening for his name in the gaps between the drums. Morning came like a sigh, mist curling over the village, turning the roofs of the huts into small, hidden islands in a sea of drifting white. Hans sat cross-legged outside his shelter, turning the second bead over in his palm. He had tied the first into his hair, close behind his ear where the children liked to tug at it. But this second one felt different. He could not say why. It was smaller, almost fragile, yet when he pressed it into his skin it felt heavier than stone. The old woman was there too, not beside him but close enough that he could hear the gentle rattle of the seeds she always carried. She hummed sometimes, a thin tune that looped back on itself like a snake swallowing its tail. When he glanced at her, she only looked at the bead, then back at him, as if to say hold on to it, for now. No one spoke to Hans in words he could grasp, yet every gesture now had weight. When a woman brushed his arm while passing with a clay pot, she paused just long enough for him to feel the brush of paint on her fingers. When the children danced near his mat, they sometimes circled him, eyes wide, bare feet flicking dust into the morning air. A small imitation of the warriors' dance around the fire. He began to sense how the village watched him, not always with fear, sometimes with a quiet wonder, other times with a tension that felt like waiting for a knife to fall. He was a question they had not yet answered, a strand of foreign thread woven clumsily into their tapestry. And the forest seemed to know it too. Every dawn, when the mists rose, Hans felt it. The sense that if he stepped just 10 paces into the green, the vines would close behind him, the trees would whisper his name to things he could not see, and he would vanish like smoke from a dying fire. It was Cunhambebe who summoned him next. The boy came again, the bold child with the missing tooth who never spoke more than a single word at a time. This time he did not point. He simply held out his hand, palm up, fingers curled like roots reaching for water. Hans placed the bead into the boy's hand, An instinct he did not question, and the boy closed his fingers around it, nodding once before turning away. Hans followed. They passed beyond the familiar circle of huts, beyond the clearing where the post stood draped in feathered strings. They moved deeper, where the forest grew thicker, the air wet and sweet with rot and blooming vines. Birdsong stitched itself between the trunks, but beneath it Hans heard other sounds, low rustles, the snap of small branches, the steady hush of something larger moving just out of sight. When they reached the edge of a small rise, Hans saw them, the gathering. Warriors, elders, women with baskets of herbs and smoldering sticks. Cunhambebe stood at the center, a black streak of paint crossing his broad chest from shoulder to hip. Around him lay the remains of a small fire, bones picked clean, laid in a circle like spokes of a wheel. They made space for Hans without words. The boy placed the bead onto a flat stone beside the bones. Cunhambebe gestured for Hans to sit. He obeyed, folding himself onto the damp ground. The old woman appeared too, slipping from the green like a spirit uncoiling from the trees. She settled beside him, her seeds whispering in her palm. A hum rose low, almost under breath. The warriors began to stamp the ground in time with the hum, a soft drum made by feet and earth alone. One by one, the elders stepped forward, dropping small offerings onto the stone. Curls of bark, bits of feather, once, even a tiny shard of dull iron that looked suspiciously European. Hans understood. This was not for him, not exactly. He was the vessel, the channel through which they spoke to something older, hungrier, more patient than any living eye. The bone bead, the painted chest, the whispered chants. All of it threads weaving him into a net he could neither see nor untangle. When Cunhambebe spoke, the hum fell away. The chief's voice was calm, so calm that Hans's shoulders dropped without him realizing it. He did not understand the words, but the cadence was clear. The way each phrase rose, paused, fell like a measured wave against a shore. A declaration, or a bargain. The old woman leaned close, her breath warm against his cheek. She pressed something into Hans's hand, a small bundle of dried leaves, bound with twine. She closed his fingers around it, then tapped his chest twice with 2 fingers. Hans did what his instincts told him. He lifted the bundle to his lips, breathing over it as if to wake it, then placed it gently onto the stone with the bead. The elders nodded, murmuring their approval. Cunhambebe reached out then, pressing a flat palm to Hans's brow. The heat of his skin, the weight behind the gesture, it felt like an anointing. Hans fought the urge to flinch. The forest held its breath. Even the birds fell silent. When the chief withdrew his hand, the hum resumed. The old woman rose, scattering a handful of seeds onto the ground. They rolled between the bones and beads like tiny dice, landing where they chose. The ritual ended as softly as it had begun.
No shout, no drumbeat.
Only the rustle of leaves reclaiming the clearing. Hans rose when Cunhambebe did. Together, they stepped back through the path the others left behind. A thin line of trampled earth already vanishing under the forest's restless green. Back in the village, Hans was no longer alone, yet somehow more isolated than ever. He was offered bowls of food first now, bits of dried meat, fruit soaked in something bitter and strong. Children no longer tugged at his hair without permission. Women stepped aside when he passed, but their eyes lingered longer than before. He realized slowly that he had become a new shape in their minds, no longer simply a captive, but not yet a kin. He was the man who spoke to invisible ears, the mouth through which old spirits might speak back. And that made him useful. It made him dangerous too, for a tool that fails is thrown away, but a tool that frightens its masters is broken first. At night, the drums returned, always distant but never absent. Hans lay awake, the taste of the bitter drink still on his tongue, wondering what new shape they would carve from his flesh tomorrow. One evening, he saw the girl again, the small one who had once handed him a stick and run off giggling. She appeared near his hut, barefoot, face smeared with a line of blue paint down her nose. She carried nothing, said nothing, only stared at him with wide eyes that reflected the dying firelight like polished stone. Hans lifted his hand in greeting, but she did not move. Instead, she mimed something, a small, simple motion. 2 fingers to her lips, then a gesture outward, as if blowing a seed into the wind. He did not understand. She waited, eyes patient, unblinking. So Hans repeated the motion, fingers to lips, a breath out. The girl smiled, teeth flashing white in the dusk, then vanished into the shadows between the huts. Hans sat back, his heartbeat loud in his ears. A message, he thought, or perhaps a blessing. Or perhaps just another knot tied in the thread that bound him here, body and spirit alike. In his dreams that night, he heard the old woman's rattle. He dreamed of beads rolling across his chest like drops of rain, of vines creeping into his mouth, twining around his tongue until the words that spilled out were no longer his own. When he woke, the dawn mist was waiting, cool and soft against his skin. He touched the place behind his ear where the first bead lay tangled in his hair, felt warmer than before. Somewhere beyond the clearing, the drums began again. Slow, patient, unending. Hans sat very still, listening to the forest breathe. For 3 days after the ritual in the clearing, the village shifted in ways so subtle Hans would have missed them if not for the gnawing knot in his chest. He saw it in how the warriors handled their spears. Sharper points, edges scraped with stone until they gleamed like animal teeth. He saw it in how the older men gathered near the great fire at dusk, voices pitched low but faces tense, glancing over their shoulders at the forest that pulsed with insects and shadows. And he felt it in the silence. The songs at night grew softer, the drumming slower. Not absent, never absent, but cautious. It was as if the forest itself waited for a question to be answered. Hans spent those days under the old woman's watchful eye. She did not tie him, did not guard him with spear or club, but she was never far. She sat near his hut at dawn, rattling her seeds in slow circles while the mist rose from the ground. She watched him eat, watched him wash his hands in the shallow basin they gave him. Sometimes she offered him small bundles of herbs or bark, pressing them into his palm without words. Hans always accepted them, though he did not know whether to swallow them, burn them, or bury them beneath his mat. The children sensed the tension too. They came less often, and when they did, they stayed at the edge of his shadow, never close enough to touch. The little girl with the blue paint did not return, though Hans sometimes thought he heard her soft humming near the line of trees at night, a melody so faint it could have been the wind. The only ones who approached him boldly now were the warriors. Twice each day, they came in pairs, standing before him like carved figures, faces painted in streaks of red and white that made their eyes look deeper, older than their years. They said nothing, but they watched him closely as if measuring the truth beneath his skin. One evening, as dusk bent the forest into gold and gray, Cunhambebe sent for him again. This time there was no boy to fetch him, no gentle gesture. A warrior appeared at the door of Hans's hut, a giant of a man with his lower lip pierced by a thin bone needle that flickered when he breathed. He tapped the spear but once against the ground and pointed toward the clearing where the first fire had burned weeks ago. Hans rose, palms damp, knees trembling not from fear of violence but fear of what he might have to become next. The clearing was not empty. A circle of warriors waited there, their bodies painted in new patterns tonight, black swirls mixed with streaks of green. At the center stood Cunhambebe, his hair unbound, shoulders painted with wide bands that made him look even broader, like a carved pillar planted in the soil. Beside him was another man Hans did not know, a stranger by the look of his clothes, a scrap of torn linen clinging to one shoulder. His wrists were bound, his ankles too, but his eyes were not afraid. They burned bright, sharp with anger or disbelief. Portuguese, Hans guessed. A lost sailor, maybe a deserter. Another reminder of the world that lay far beyond this village's breath. Cunhambebe lifted a hand, palm out. The circle of warriors stepped back a single pace, and the clearing held its breath. The chief spoke first. Words slow and clear, not for Hans to understand but for the others to witness. His voice did not rise. It sank, like a stone dropped into still water. The old woman stepped from the shadows, carrying her seeds. Her tunic dyed with fresh stripes of yellow that glowed under the flickering torches. She did not look at Hans. She looked at the sky, as if searching for something among the branches and drifting smoke. When Cunhambebe finished, he turned to Hans and spoke a single word, a question, though Hans could not know its meaning. The chief pointed at the bound man, then at Hans's chest, then up at the sky. Hans understood, in the marrow of his bones if not in his mind. They wanted him to speak for this man, to name him, to measure him, to decide if the spirits favored him or would claim him for the smoke and teeth. Hans knelt, his stomach roiling. He looked at the stranger. The man glared back, jaw clenched, breath ragged through cracked lips. Hans could almost see himself in that glare. The same fear, the same defiance, the same prayer that someone, anyone, would intervene. But no ships would come tonight. No thunder of cannon fire, no flag of the crown snapping in the breeze. There was only Hans, the Kaiba, the accidental spirit man who now must prove he was more than painted shadows and half-whispered psalms. Hans reached for the old woman's bundle. She offered it without expression. He untied the twine, found leaves, a pinch of gray ash, a twist of bark inside. He crushed them in his palm, breathed over them the way she had taught him, then pressed the mix to the prisoner's forehead. The man flinched but did not resist. Hans whispered in Latin again, psalms half-remembered from boyhood, lines he did not truly believe but that tumbled out smooth and hollow like river stones. He let the words fill the hush, let them echo into the watching trees. He touched the man's chest, feeling the frantic drum of his heart. He pressed his thumb to the man's throat, feeling the pulse throb beneath skin that smelled of salt and fear. He traced a circle in the air, mimicking the ritual the elders had shown him days before. When he looked up, Cunhambebe was watching, not with suspicion, but with the patient focus of a hunter sighting prey. The chief spoke one word, a soft rumble that slipped between the leaves. The old woman repeated it near Hans's ear. He did not know what it meant, but when the chief pointed again, Hans nodded. He rose slowly, turned to the waiting circle, lifted his palm, slick with sweat and bits of ash. He said a word, nonsense, but shaped like their words, thick at the throat, soft at the on-d. The forest seemed to lean closer, listening. The warriors shifted, spears lowered, bodies relaxed. The old woman rattled her seeds once, twice. Cunhambebe stepped forward, pressed his massive hand to Hans's shoulder. The message was clear. The stranger would not bleed tonight. The circle broke. Warriors untied the man's wrists but left his ankles bound, leading him away with careful hands. He stumbled once, glancing back at Hans with eyes that flickered between hatred and desperate gratitude. Then he vanished into the shadows beyond the clearing. Cunhambebe lingered beside Hans, silent but near enough that Hans could feel the warmth of his skin through the humid night air. The chief reached up, tracing a single finger through the ash still stuck to Hans's brow, then flicked it into the darkness. The old woman caught Hans's eye, and for the first time in days, she smiled, small, brittle, but real. When they returned to the village, the drums began again, this time soft, like a heartbeat beneath blankets. Hans sat near his hut, staring at his palms, still gray with ash. He wondered if the stranger would survive the forest, if he would find his way back to the Portuguese enclaves, or fall to snakes and shadows that waited beyond the light of the fires. He wondered, too, what stories the man might tell if he survived. Tales of the pale spirit man who whispered lies in the dark, who bought time with words he did not understand. Sleep did not come easy. When it did, it came in shards, dreams of the shipwreck, of waves swallowing masts and sails. Dreams of the old woman's seeds rolling over his tongue like teeth. Dreams of the forest alive with voices that called him deeper and deeper into the green until he woke, breathless, tangled in the vines of his own hair. At dawn, he rose and stepped barefoot into the mist. He let the damp earth soak the last of the ash from his skin. He breathed the forest's breath. Somewhere behind him, a child's laughter flickered through the mist, quick as a heartbeat, gone before he could turn. And when the sun lifted through the canopy like a blade splitting the night, Hans felt the knot inside him pull tighter. He was the Kaiba now, not just by name, not just by fear, but by bargain. By smoke and bone and lies turned real by hungry eyes. The village had seen him stand in the clearing. They had heard the hush when he spoke. They had believed, and belief, he knew now, was the strongest chain of all. Nights in the village bled into each other like the long pulse of the drums. By now, Hans had learned to listen for subtle shifts, when the rhythm quickened near dawn, when distant echoes came from deeper in the jungle. The Tupinamba were not a people of secrets, yet Hans felt that secrets surrounded him at all times. Not hidden behind locked doors, but woven into the hush between chants, the tilt of a warrior's head, the way the old woman traced symbols in the dirt and erased them before sunrise. A month had passed since the ritual by the fire pit, or so Hans guessed. Days no longer fit into any measure he knew. His mind, once precise with calendars and ship logs, now drifted. The European sense of time fractured under the canopy. The sun rose, the sun fell, the drums beat, the jungle murmured. Yet beneath that hypnotic rhythm, something sharper pressed against his ribs each night. He had survived, that much was clear. He was not meat. He was not exactly a guest either. He was a figure with edges that didn't fit. He was useful, yes, but usefulness, he saw, was a fragile shield. Any shift, a failed blessing, a sudden sickness, a famine, could snap it. The old woman, he still did not know her name, lingered near him more often now. She never sat too close, never spoke in words he grasped. But sometimes she offered him tiny clues. The rattle of seeds when he asked about the weather, a sharp gesture toward the forest when he asked about strangers. He learned to read her moods the way he once read the sea. One evening she came to him just before dusk. She sat near the entrance to his hut, her silhouette blocking the dying light. Slowly, she unwrapped a bundle of woven cloth. Inside, a bone knife, its edge worn smooth from careful sharpening. She did not hand it to him. She placed it beside his sleeping mat, tapping it twice with her fingertips. Then she rose and walked away. Hans stared at the knife for a long time. The message was not unclear. She had given him a choice or a warning, or perhaps both. Was she telling him to prepare to defend himself, to escape, or to perform some ritual act if the drums ever called his name? Sleep came in fragments that night. He dreamed of Germany. Snow on a church roof, his mother's voice muffled by winter walls, bread warm from the oven. He dreamed of the sea, the ships, the salt that bit his lips when the waves rose too high. But the dreams always bent back to the fire pit, the chants, the smell of burning flesh and spices. He woke before dawn, sweating. The next morning brought visitors, strangers, not from the village but from a neighboring tribe. Their paint was different. Bolder strokes of yellow and blue that marked their faces like streaks of lightning. They carried bundles wrapped in palm leaves, trade goods, smoked fish, woven baskets, feathers dyed in rare colors. The Tupinamba welcomed them with cautious warmth. Children giggled at the visitors' odd words. The warriors eyed their spears. Hans, though, felt a prickle at the base of his neck. Outsiders brought news and questions. He knew enough now to listen for what went unsaid. Through half-understood exchanges, he pieced together rumors. Portuguese raiders, new ships along the coast, villages burned in the night. Somewhere, a priest had been captured, then ransomed. Somewhere, a white man had fled a plantation and vanished upriver. These whispers clung to Hans like smoke. They reminded him there was a world beyond this circle of thatch and drumming. and that the world might yet reach in to claim him. That night, he sat near the central fire with the old woman and 3 elders. They passed a gourd of thick drink, darker than any Hans had tasted before. It numbed his tongue and made his thoughts drift sideways. He heard his own voice speaking or trying to, bits of Tupi tangled with German prayers, half-remembered Latin. He saw the old woman's eyes on him, patient, unblinking, as if waiting for him to reveal something buried in his chest. When he woke the next day, the knife was gone from his mat. In its place lay a single feather, black tipped with white. A symbol, surely, but of what? Freedom? Death? Or both? The days that followed blurred into a quiet tension. The strangers left. The Tupinamba resumed their cycles of fishing, weaving, feasting. Hans did what he could to remain useful. He helped carry water. He mimicked rituals when asked. He whispered nonsense prayers when a mother brought him her coughing child. He said the right words, or what he hoped were the right words, when warriors passed him by. One afternoon, he heard a commotion near the river. A boy, no older than 10, had caught something in a woven trap. Not fish, but a monkey, tiny and screeching. The village gathered to watch. To Hans's surprise, the monkey was not killed for meat. Instead, the old woman took it gently, untied the binding from its foot, and released it back toward the trees. The villagers watched it vanish into the green shadows. Some clapped, some whispered words Hans could not catch. He sensed it was a blessing, a small sign that life moved in loops, that what was taken could sometimes be given back. That night, he thought of the monkey when he lay awake. He wondered, was he also a captive to be released? Or was he the sacrifice that would make the next harvest strong? The old woman's feather haunted him. Hans's chance came not through boldness but by drift. One dawn, a group of men prepared to hunt inland. Deep inland, far enough that they would be gone 2 or 3 days. The old woman's eyes met his as they packed spears and nets. Again she said nothing, but she stepped close enough to press a scrap of dried fruit into his hand. In that gesture he felt it, now. So when they left, Hans volunteered to carry baskets. He walked at the back of the line. He kept his head down. He said nothing when a warrior glanced back to check his place. They moved single file through a tangle of vines and wet earth, the sun dappling the forest floor in restless shapes. When they camped for the night near a creek, Hans pretended sleep. He lay curled near the fire, heartbeat a hammer in his chest. When the men's breathing deepened, when the last embers crumbled to black, Hans rose on bare feet. He stepped around the circle. He held his breath as he passed the warrior who snored loudest. The jungle opened around him like a waiting mouth. Flight in the jungle is not a sprint, it's a crawling prayer. Each footfall must be silent, each branch avoided. The vines tug at your ankles like hands trying to pull you back. The insects become your chorus. The dark swallows your sense of direction.
Hans stumbled.
He clawed at roots. He pressed his ear to the soil to listen for footsteps behind him. The forest gave him nothing but the steady hum of its own life. By dawn, he was soaked in sweat and river water. He had no idea which way the sea lay, only that somewhere ahead, the trees would thin. Somewhere ahead was hope, or at least freedom from certain knives. He slept curled under ferns, mouth dry, hands shaking. He dreamed again of the fire pit, the chant, the smell. He dreamed of the old woman, her hand on his chest. He dreamed of the feather. He woke to rain. By his best guess, he was 2 days from the coast. He could smell salt in the breeze when the wind shifted. His feet were cut raw. His throat burned for clean water. He found a stream and drank until his belly cramped. He ate bitter berries that numbed his tongue. At night he heard drums, faint, distant, maybe echoes in his head, maybe the forest itself laughing, maybe the Tupinamba still watching him, even now, through eyes he could not see. But Hans kept moving. One more step, one more day, one more chance to see a ship sail on the horizon. The rain did not stop. It came in bursts, sudden, drumming down through the canopy like fists on a drumskin. Then it faded, leaving the undergrowth steaming and the paths slick as eel skins. Hans moved through it half blind, half awake, more creature than man now. Clothes reduced to rags, hair matted with leaf litter, skin painted in cuts and insect bites. When the sun did break through the tangled roof of green, it came in shards that looked almost holy. He'd stop in those bright patches, let the warmth find his bones. He whispered prayers then, not in Latin but in a half-forgotten German, the one his mother's cracked voice had used when the winter wind rattled their shutters back home. But there was no warmth that stayed. The forest was not a place of shelter. It was a maze of constant motion. Even when Hans found water, he knew it might poison him. Even when he found fruit, he knew the seeds might kill him slow. Yet still he ate, still he drank, still he moved. On the third day, he stumbled on footprints. Not his own, too large, too fresh. Bare toes pressed deep in the mud. The prints angled downslope, toward where he guessed the sea might be. He crouched beside them, pressing a finger into the indent. Still soft, not more than an hour old. He could follow, where he could veer away. The thought of more Tupinamba or worse, Portuguese slavers combing the interior, turned his stomach cold. But to hide alone in the green was death too. He chose the prince. A stranger's fire. At dusk he smelled smoke. Not the thin curl of village cooking fires. This was sharper, mixed with the tang of charred wood and something oily. He crept low, belly dragging wet ferns, ears straining for voices. Then he saw it, a clearing ringed with fallen logs. At its center, a lean man hunched over a tiny fire that barely held together in the drizzle. The man was not painted. He wore scraps of cloth around his waist. Near his knee lay an old rusted sword, Portuguese steel by the look of it. And near his fire were 3 fish, gutted but not yet cooked. Hans watched for a long moment. His body screamed for warmth, for food, for company even if it killed him. He stepped forward, careful not to break a branch. The man heard anyway, his head snapped up, hand darting for the sword. They froze, 2 ghosts at the edge of the flame. Hans raised both hands. He forced a word out of his cracked throat. Amigo, a word from the Portuguese sailors who'd cursed him years before. The man did not lower the blade but did not rise either. His eyes darted over Hans's filthy skin, the raw red cuts, the trembling knees. He spat to the side, then gestured with his chin to the fire. Hans stepped forward, closer, into the warmth. He sank to his knees near the crackling sticks, arms held out like a man begging for absolution. Neither spoke for a long time. The stranger speared a fish on a stick, leaned it into the flame. The smell nearly broke Hans in half. His stomach growled so loud the stranger barked out a short, hard laugh. Name? The man asked, heavily accented Portuguese. Hans. The man said nothing. When the fish crisped at the edges, he broke it in 2, tossed half to Hans without ceremony. The meat was hot, soft. Grease dripped down Hans's chin. He did not care. He ate every shred, even the charred skin. Later, when the stars punched through the canopy, the man spoke again. His name was Gasper, a deserter, he said, from a sugar mill, or maybe a mission. The details tangled together. He gestured inland. Ran. Years ago. They don't look here. Too many ghosts.
Hans liste ned. Noddning.
He tried to shape words, told Gasper half-truths. Shipwreck, capture, drumming nights, the woman with seeds. He did not say cannibal. He did not say ritual. Some words needed to stay buried or they'd sprout in a stranger's head. Gasper's eyes narrowed when Hans mentioned the Tupinamba. He spat again. Demons, he said in Portuguese, but better than Portuguese devils. He told Hans how the forest swallowed men. He knew trails, rivers that bled out to the salt marshes, old paths the Tupinamba used when they traded fish for iron blades. He spoke of white sails offshore, how sometimes they anchored just far enough that no warrior's arrow could reach them. Gasper said he'd seen French ships too. Traders with barrels of wine and bags of powder, men who'd swap steel for parrots, feathers, and flesh. Hans felt the old hunger bloom in him, the thought of a deck beneath his feet, of sails snapping, of any escape that smelled of salt instead of rot. He asked Gasper if he would guide him out. Gasper laughed. Not kindly, but not cruelly either. Maybe, he said, or maybe I sell you to them, trade you for iron, for powder. You're worth meat to them, same as monkey. Hans said nothing. There was no defense. He lay back on the damp earth, staring at stars he did not know how to name. He slept. He dreamed of drums, always drums. Gasper woke him at dawn with a hard kick to the ribs.
No greeting.
No warning. Just move. They broke camp in silence, leaving the fire to smolder. Gasper walked ahead, sword slung loose at his hip. Hans stumbled behind, feet raw, every step a silent prayer that the man would not turn, would not draw the blade and take back the fish's mercy. The trail bent downward, sometimes vanishing under green tidipools of moss. They crossed streams, stepped over roots thicker than Hans's thigh. Gasper knew where he was going, that much was clear. When they stopped, he picked roots for chewing, found grubs under rotten logs, forced Hans to eat them too. They did not speak of escape again. It lay between them like an open wound. At night, Gasper would bind Hans's ankle to a tree with a rope of twisted fiber. Not tight, but tight enough to say, I know what hunger makes you do. On the fifth night, the sound of waves reached them at last, distant, muffled by dunes and tangled mangrove. Hans nearly wept. He could taste the salt on the wind. He could smell something alive beyond the endless green. But Gasper made no rush for the shore. He crouched low behind a fallen trunk, pointing through the branches at a flicker of firelight far down the slope. There, he whispered, settlers, or traders, or worse. Wait. Hans's legs trembled. He could not wait. His mind clawed at him. If you do not run now, you will never run. Gasper saw it in his eyes, the raw edge of a man about to bolt. He put a hand on Hans's shoulder. Not gently, not cruelly either. Run, they kill you, he said flatly. Run with me, maybe not. They waited for the moon. When it climbed fat and yellow behind the palms, Gasper led Hans in a half-crouch through the mangroves. The mud sucked at their feet. Mosquitoes whined at their ears. Somewhere ahead, the waves hissed and boomed like far-off cannon fire. Then the clearing opened before them, a rough encampment of barrels and tarred cloth. 2 boats drawn up on the beach. Figures moved in the glow of lanterns. Men in loose shirts, knives tucked into belts, voices thick with Portuguese, French, scraps of Tupi. Hans's heart slammed. He scanned for sails, for any sign that a ship lay beyond the black water. He saw nothing, but he smelled it: tar, salt, hope. Gasper pulled him low behind a stack of barrels. He hissed in Hans's ear, "No, stupid. Talk first. Trade." They waited until one of the men, a broad-shouldered figure with a red sash, stepped away from the others to piss in the shadows. Gasper rose, bold as a snake, one hand up. Hans stumbled behind him. Voices, sharp, hands gesturing. Gasper spoke too fast for Hans to catch it all. Words like silver, passage, white man, useful. The man with the sash spat into the sand. He glanced at Hans like a butcher weighing a calf. He called to someone by the fires. Another man appeared, French by the sound of his curses. Hans heard one word over and over, cannibal, spoken like a joke, spoken like a threat. Gasper's voice rose, urgent now. Hans felt the world tilt. This was the trade. His life for something Gasper wanted more. Powder, rum, passage. A blade flickered in the firelight, not drawn but shown. Hans's breath came in shallow gasps. He thought of the old woman's bone knife, of the feather, of the drumming that had never truly left his ears. Hans's tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. The men at the fire spoke in a blend of harsh Portuguese and rolling French, words snapping at each other like dogs fighting over scraps. Gasper argued that much was clear. His hands sliced the air. He pointed at Hans like he was pointing at a sack of gold. Hans felt it in his bones, the old trade returning. His skin, his teeth, his story. Everything about him was currency. The Portuguese had once used him for labor. The Tupinamba had used him for ritual. Now Gasper would sell him for powder, rum, or a promise of safe passage. A shape moved behind Hans, quick, silent. He flinched, but a rough hand clamped his arm, steering him closer to the fire. He smelled sweat and fish oil. One of the sailors, a young man with teeth stained dark from chewing bark, laughed in Hans's face. He said something Hans couldn't follow, but the tone was clear. Monkey, prize, not quite human. Gasper kept talking. His voice rose, desperate. The man in the red sash, clearly the leader, folded his arms. He spat into the coals. His eyes slid over Hans, weighing the pale skin, the bones still unbroken. Then he barked a single command. Two men grabbed Hans's arms. Not gently, they jerked him forward, closer to the light. Gasper opened his mouth to protest, but one of the sailors slammed a fist into his gut, doubling him over. Gasper wheezed, coughing blood into the sand. Hans's mind raced. This was no rescue. This was not the voyage home. This was just another cage. New ropes, new masters. His knees buckled. He tasted the smoke and the sea. He thought of the drums that never truly left his skull. Hans had one chance. It did not feel like courage, more like the last reflex of a cornered animal. When the sailor pushed him to the ground, Hans twisted. The man's blade was at his belt, half-drawn, loose in the scabbard. Hans's fingers found the hilt by sheer blind instinct. The next sound was wet and sharp. The sailor howled, clutching his thigh. Blood spattered the coals. Gasper lurched forward, but another man kicked him down again. Hans did not stay to see what came next. He ran, not toward the boats. They were too close to the firelight, too thick with shadows ready to lunge. He ran for the dark, for the line where the sand turned to tangled mangrove. Shouts rose behind him. Footsteps slapped wet earth. A pistol barked once, the shot going wide, chewing bark from a nearby tree. Hans crashed through black water up to his knees. Roots clawed at his ankles. He flung himself into the brush, belly down, eyes wide. He did not breathe, did not dare. He heard men crashing after him, but the jungle that had once caged him now hid him. He was the ghost now, the thing half seen in the dark. Hans crawled until the shouts faded, until the roar of the surf drowned every sound but the drumming in his chest. He found himself in a hollow between roots thick as barrels. The moon slipped through slits in the leaves, silver on his raw hands. He curled there, half in mud, half in salt water. He did not sleep. He could not. His eyes traced the stars through the gaps. Old stars, his mother's stars, the same ones that had watched him pray in Cologne when he was a boy too small to carry wood. He wanted to weep. He wanted to scream. Instead, he lay silent, tasting the ocean air, telling himself that this time he would not let himself be traded again. This time he would choose what to give and what to keep. At dawn, the beach was empty. Hans crept out of the mangrove, every joint screaming. The traders were gone. Boats vanished, only ashes where the fire had been. A half-burned barrel lay cracked on its side. He found a fishhook in the sand, rusted but sharp enough. He took it. It was a weapon, a tool, a thing to clutch when the fear clawed at him. He turned his eyes to the surf. Beyond the breakers, the ocean spread smooth as hammered tin. Somewhere out there was home, ships he could not see, sails that might carry him back to a world where men killed each other with muskets and hunger instead of bone knives and songs. He laughed then, a raw sound, half-human. He knew too much now to belong anywhere. Not German, not Tupinamba, not Portuguese. He was the story that walked between them all, the ghost they could trade but never truly own. 2 days later, Hans heard it, the crack of canvas snapping in the salt wind. He stumbled to the highest dune, half blind with hunger. There it was, a caravel, French by the rigging, dropping anchor in the shallows. Men in wide hats leaned over the rail, pointing at the coast. Hans waved, first with one hand, then both, his whole body a flag of desperate hope. He screamed every word he knew. Help, here, friend, German, alive. The words tangled together like roots underwater. A boat was lowered, oars dipped, figures rowed toward him. He sank to his knees in the hot sand, sobbing laughter into his blistered palms. He did not know if they would believe him. He did not know if they would chain him or feed him. But this was a door swinging open, and he would crawl through it if he had to tear every old ghost from his bones. The French captain listened with cold eyes. Hans poured out his story. The shipwreck, the Tupinamba, the fires, the drums, the painted warriors who sang him alive and dead in the same breath. Some of the sailors laughed. Some crossed themselves. The captain did not move. He asked Hans if he had any proof. Hans shook his head. All he had were the scars, the half-mad eyes, the words that tumbled out like prayer. The captain conferred with his men. In the end, they gave Hans a place near the barrels of salt pork. They did not trust him. They fed him little, but they did not bind him. Not at first. Days later, as the coastline slipped into haze behind them, Hans lay on the deck under a coil of rope. He could taste the brine on his lips, the creak of wood beneath him, the low murmur of French songs drifting up from the hold. He was going home, or something like it. Salt wind burned Hans's cracked lips as the French caravel groaned over the swell. Every morning he rose before the rest, standing at the rail, staring at the empty line where ocean met sky. He knew he should have felt hope, salvation even, but something heavy clung to his bones. He was a man caught between shores. At night he dreamed of the drums. Not the way they had sounded when he lay captive beneath a palm roof. These drums were deeper, as if the ocean itself had learned to sing like the Tupinamba. Sometimes he woke to find himself whispering their words, syllables that tasted like ash and bone. The Frenchman watched him. He saw it in their eyes, the way they kept their knives close when he drew near, the way they crossed themselves when they thought he couldn't see. They wanted his story, but not his presence. They fed him, clothed him in scratchy linen that reeked of tar and mildew, but they did not invite him to eat with them. He ate alone. He spoke to the gulls. He whispered to the salt. Weeks at sea stretched into months. Storms battered the caravel's sides, and once they sighted pirates on the horizon. But the ship survived, slipping away like a fish darting through reeds. Hans survived too. His ribs no longer jutted like fence posts. His hair grew shaggy. His voice returned, stronger each day as he retold the tale. First to the quartermaster who demanded the same answers every dusk. Then to the cook who pressed him for details of the painted devils. They all wanted something different from him. Some wanted horror, a tale of monsters who danced around human flesh. Others wanted miracles, proof that a Christian could outwit devils by faith alone. Hans gave them both. He learned how to twist his words like vines, how to make his voice tremble just enough when he described the clearing fire, the carved bone blade, the boy's small hand resting on his knee. He began to see it then. His freedom would never come for free. His body had survived the jungle, but his memory would forever be their currency. And so he gave it piece by piece, like meat scraped from bone. When the caravel finally sighted land, Lisbon's crooked skyline rising out of the morning haze, Hans wept, not with relief but with a bitter, choking joy that tasted of all the salt he'd swallowed at sea. They did not let him wander freely. 2 sailors marched him through the muddy docks, past fishmongers shouting over baskets of wriggling eels, past beggars hunched against sun-bleached walls. His skin shone pale among the sailors' tan shoulders, proof that he was not one of them, would never be one of them. They brought him to a merchant's hall, damp stone, thick with the smell of parchment and spilled wine. There, a man in a black doublet, rich cloth, fine lace at the wrists, waited behind a table piled high with ledgers. The sailors spoke rapidly. The man nodded once, twice. Then he turned to Hans and demanded his story. Hans told it again. He found that the more he spoke, the more his tongue remembered the rhythms. He left nothing out, or at least nothing that would make the story dull. He told of the prayers he had whispered over the chief's son. He told of the boy's breath returning, the villagers' gasps, the women's chants. He told of Gasper, half lie, half truth, how he had betrayed him, sold him to traders who would have stripped his flesh from his bones if he hadn't fought like a cornered beast. The man in the black doublet took notes. He asked Hans to repeat himself, again and again until the words blurred. Finally, he pressed a coin into Hans's palm. Heavy silver, stamped with a cross. "Go," the man said. "Tell it in Cologne. Tell it in every church that will have you." Cologne was not as Hans remembered. Its streets were colder, narrower, the church bells shriller than the songs he carried in his skull. He found his mother's house abandoned. The shutters hung loose on rusted hinges. Neighbors, when they recognized him at all, spoke of plague, of war, of families fleeing the city's hunger. Hans drifted from one parish to another. He offered his tale to priests who listened with guarded eyes. Some called him mad. Others called him blessed, a witness to the savage edges of the known world. They gave him bread, a blanket, sometimes a bed in the rectory loft. In exchange, they asked him to stand before crowded pews and speak. So he did. It was a scribe, thin, stooped, fingers stained with ink, who first asked if Hans would commit it all to parchment. "Your tongue will fail you," the scribe warned, "but ink does not." Hans sat in a drafty chamber above a print shop, the walls lined with woodcuts of saints and martyrs. He scratched his story onto paper with a quill so blunt he had to sharpen it every few lines. His Latin was crude, patched together from half-remembered psalms and tavern gossip. But the scribe polished it, made it smooth where it needed to be smooth, jagged where it needed to cut. They printed it, hundreds of copies, then thousands. Hans's face appeared on the cover, or something like it. An engraving of a pale man, hands raised in prayer as shadowy figures danced around a fire behind him. The words beneath his likeness named him not just survivor but prophet, a Christian Jonah spat up by the heathen world to warn the faithful. In markets and taverns, people read his words aloud. Children whispered of the painted men who cracked bones between their teeth. Old priests thundered from pulpits, using Hans's tale as proof that Christ's light must pierce every jungle's darkness. Sometimes Hans sat in the back of those churches. He watched the flicker of candlelight on marble saints. He listened to his own story, twisted now by tongues that wanted miracles more than truth. Each time they spoke of his bravery, he saw the old woman's eyes. Each time they praised his faith, he smelled the smoke drifting from the clearing pit. Years passed. Hans grew older. His beard turned the color of ash. He kept a single strip of painted cloth tucked in a box beneath his bed, a scrap from the waist wrap they had given him when they first stripped away his European skin. He would hold it some nights, rub the threads between his thumb and forefinger until sleep took him. He never returned to Brazil. He never saw the painted warriors again, except in his dreams, where they circled him in endless dance, their chants louder than the church bells, their drums echoing through the quiet corridors of Cologne's stone streets. Some said he made it all up, that no tribe could be so orderly in their cruelty, so reverent in their feasting. Others believed every word, pointing to the pages as proof that the world was bigger, darker, holier than they had ever dared believe. Hans stopped defending himself. He let them argue. He let the presses roll. His story was theirs now, traded like spices and silver, passed hand to hand, whispered in fear and wonder. At night he would stand in his small garden. The city's rooftops spread around him like a sea of red tiles, and he would hum the drum rhythms under his breath, not to summon spirits, not to defy God, just to remember that once he had belonged to something too vast to fit inside any church's walls. In the end, it was not the drums that haunted Hans most. It was the silence that came after. He lived out his years in Cologne, tending a small patch of soil behind the house of a distant cousin who pitied him enough to offer a spare bed. Children crept by his fence to glimpse the strange old man who claimed to have survived the world's edge. Some days they'd taunt him. "Tell us a story, cannibal man." Hans would ignore them. Sometimes he'd sit on the bench beneath a pear tree, a book in his lap, pages stiff with age and salt. The book was his own, the same story printed and reprinted, passed from bishop to merchant to peasant. Each copy carried the same woodcut, the German castaway raising his hands skyward while shadows danced at the forest's rim. People believed what they needed to. One winter evening, when the frost crept along the windows, Hans received a visitor. A young monk, hardly older than Hans had been when he first stepped aboard a ship bound for Brazil, knocked at his crooked door. "I've come for your blessing," the boy said, eyes wide with borrowed courage. "They say you saw devils in the New World and came back holy." Hans almost laughed. Almost. He gestured for the monk to sit beside the hearth. They shared stale bread and watered wine, and Hans spoke. Slowly, words thick as the smoke that curled up from the burning log. He told the boy of the voyage, the first sight of that lush coastline where the world bloomed like Eden and rotted like hell. He described the forest's breath, the hum of insects that spoke secrets to the leaves. He painted the faces of the Tupinamba, warriors with skull paint, children with sticky fingers pressed to his beard, the old woman who rattled seeds and sang truths Hans never understood. The monk crossed himself when Hans reached the clearing, the captive tied to the post, the blade of bone and shell, the taste of salt and fat drifting on jungle wind. Hans did not flinch. He did not embellish. He did not hide the part where he had pressed his own lies into the villagers' faith, stitching Latin prayers into their songs to buy himself another day of breath. When he finished, the monk whispered, "And you still believe in God?" Hans leaned closer to the dying fire. "I believe in hunger," he said, "and I believe in stories." In spring, Hans would sometimes stand barefoot in the garden's muddy rows, eyes closed, head tilted back to the cathedral bells that pealed over Cologne. If he listened hard enough, sometimes he heard the drums instead, deep, measured, older than stone and stained glass. He never married. He fathered no children to carry his name, only pages to carry his memory. But travelers came to his door from time to time. Merchants from Antwerp, students from Wittenberg, sailors who smelled of brine and tar. Each wanted the same thing, to sit across from him and hear, in a cracked German rasp, how a man could stand at the fire's edge and come back whole. He never told it the same way twice. Sometimes the old woman saved him. Sometimes the painted warriors let him go because they saw a ghost in his eyes. Sometimes, when the nights were too long and the wind rattled the shutters like bone charms, he whispered the truth no listener ever wrote down. That maybe they kept him because they knew one day he would carry them across the ocean in the only way that could make them live forever, in story. When Hans finally lay dying, a gray, thin man who smelled of ink and garden soil, the local priest sat at his bedside to catch a final confession. The priest asked if he feared damnation for what he'd eaten, what he'd lied about, what he'd done to survive. Hans's breath rattled in his chest like a hollow gourd. He stared at the ceiling, where the candle's light danced shadows that looked, just for a heartbeat, like painted faces and coiled smoke. Does the forest confess?
Hans whispered.
The priest did not answer. In the morning, they found the strip of painted cloth still clenched in his fist, the last scrap of a world that had swallowed him and spit him back to tell its secret. Hans Staden's book spread like fire. It shaped maps drawn by men who had never felt a jungle vine tighten around their necks. It lit sermons where preachers thundered about heathen lands needing iron chains and wooden crosses. It stirred nightmares that painted all Brazil in strokes of crimson and black. Yet some scholars, centuries later, would read his words and see more than savagery. They would see the glimpse of a people who lived by a logic so old it made Europe's kingdoms look like children fighting over scraps. A tribe who saw no crime in eating what life gave them. For strength, for memory, for a bond thicker than any crown or creed. Hans became both a warning and a witness, the man who sat between drumbeats and church bells, who tasted both salt pork and human flesh, who learned that survival is never clean and truth is never simple. And so now you know the tale. Maybe you feel the forest in your lungs, the press of green shadows, the echo of drums beyond the edge of the firelight. Maybe you wonder if Hans was hero, coward, liar, or just a man who wanted to see the world and found it looking right back at him. But stories like Hans's do not belong only to the past. They live because we keep asking what they mean and what they mean about us. So tell us, where are you watching this story from? Are you in a quiet city apartment, a small village, a crowded cafe where the hum of modern life drowns out the beat of ancient drums? Drop your answer in the comments below. If this story made you pause, if you felt the fire's heat, the sea's salt, the heartbeat of a world so old we've barely begun to understand it, please like this video, subscribe for more calm history, and share your thoughts below. Your voice keeps these echoes alive. Your curiosity keeps the past breathing. And somewhere, perhaps, Hans Staden, wherever his bones rest, still listens for the next drumbeat, the next telling. Good night.